Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Mafia and Gangsters video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's continue the wonderful book, Super Mafia, Organized Crime Threatens America. This time it'll be Chapter 2, Part 2, which will wrap up this chapter for this go-around. The title again associated with Inside the Mafia. So the last part we saw how people got into the Mafia, some of the ceremonies involved, along with some of the pushback associated with law enforcement. This one will wrap up this chapter, so we'll see essentially what else is listed when it comes to being inside the Mafia and some of the super secret stuff associated with their actions. So without further ado, let's go ahead and let's do part 2 here. And here's what it says. Scarfo was not expected ever to exercise the kind of control that Bruno had for so many years. The inevitable result has been that the Gambino mob and at least 2 other families have now muscled in on Atlantic City. Some of the rituals in these wars are still accompanied by old rituals. The mafioso who was believed to have clipped Bruno was shot 14 times and stuffed into a plastic bag. His body was littered with $20 bills torn in half. This is the traditional mafia sign that a man has killed for purely mercenary reasons. Kansas City was the scene of an only slightly less bloody purging between 1976 and 1978. 13 mobsters were rubbed out. Some of them had tried to operate without permission and without paying tribute in territories controlled by the Kansas City mob. Others had breached mafia discipline in one way or another. Interestingly, the FBI learned of the plans for 5 of these killings and even passed along warnings to the intended victims, but the warnings did not save them. One of the most ambitious plots in the history of the mafia was that allegedly concocted by Joe Bonanno in the 1960s. He is said to have planned the killings of the entire New York Mafia leadership so that he could take over the personnel of the 5 families and rule and challenge over the New York area. The gunman reportedly assigned to make the hits was Joe Colombo, but he saw a better opportunity in informing 2 of New York's family chieftains, Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese. The result was the so-called Banana War, with substantial numbers of deaths on both sides. Bonanno was driven into retirement. Colombo's reward was control of the powerful Brooklyn family. Colombo eventually suffered a surprising fate. In 1970, he founded the Italian-American Civil Rights League, supposedly to combat anti-Italian prejudice and discrimination. Some 50,000 people attended its highly successful rally in June of that year in New York City's Columbus Circle. This totally unexpected activity was anything but pleasing to the other mafia leaders, who regard any kind of publicity whatsoever as potentially dangerous. At the League's second rally the following year, Colombo was shot down by a hired gunman. Other New York families, especially the Gambino mob, immediately moved in on the weakened Colombo organization and seized control of many of its rich Brooklyn rackets. So much for honor and loyalty inside the mafia. Another bloody feud recently erupted inside the Rochester, New York mob. Its operations were controlled by a group rather oddly known as Team A. A rebel group that tried to destroy Team A and take over came to be known as Team B, partly because it had relied on bombing as its main weapon. There were 6 separate bombing incidents, some against Team A individuals and some against its gambling clubs. Among those killed was Team A underboss Salvatore Gingillo, but there were also a number of innocent victims among the general public. The wave of bombings brought on an intensive investigation by federal, state, and local authorities. Gangland slayings are usually the most difficult for law enforcement authorities to solve. As FBI Chief Webster put it, they use professionals, they pick their time and their place, and historically we have not been successful in these investigations. Fear of mob revenge is such that it is virtually impossible to find witnesses willing to testify, but the Rochester case became one of the very few in which sufficient evidence could be amassed for successful prosecution. No branch of the mafia has suffered such a combination of catastrophes as the Cleveland organization. It has been torn apart by what one writer called the mob's most savage internal war in more than 2 generations. According to Edward P. Whalen, senior editor of Cleveland magazine, more than 30 mobsters from Cleveland to Youngstown have been murdered in the last 5 years in the continuing war for control of the rackets in northeastern Ohio. This ferocious conflict developed just at the same time as a determined crackdown by the FBI. The Cleveland family's boss, underboss, 4 captains, and several associates were sent to jail. Declared Joseph Griffin, head of the FBI's Cleveland office, "This is the first time in the FBI's campaign against organized crime that we've taken out the entire leadership, the structure of a major Cosa Nostra family." The overall result, says Whalen, has been to reduce a once mighty organized crime family to not much more than a ragtag platoon of old and toothless tigers. But a major metropolitan center like Cleveland, with its vast potential for illicit money making, is unlikely to remain long without a mafia setup. There is substantial evidence that the Pittsburgh mob has already begun moving in to fill the vacuum. Now, is the Cleveland gang expected to disappear completely? FBI director has warned against undue optimism about the destruction of entire mafia families. He said they have a remarkable capacity for survival. The families have the machinery for designating successors, promotions in place, that kind of thing. Next segment is called Discipline by Violence. The kinds of violence that have characterized the mafia's constantly recurring internal wars show that it is not exactly a tightly regimented and disciplined organization. Ambitious young insurgents would not challenge the established bosses so frequently if they could really be held on a tight leash. But there is discipline within the mafia, and whenever possible, it is still enforced with deadly rigor. Violations of the oath sworn by new members and of the generally understood rules of conduct can and often do lead to dire punishments. The most common cause of violence for the sake of mob discipline remains unchanged from the mafia's earliest history. It occurs when a mafioso is suspected of informing to the police. The approved method is supposed to consist of 5 shots fired upward through the victim's chin, but actual methods vary. There was a time some 30 or 40 years ago when cement shoes became a sort of instant national joke. Apparently, a notorious mafia technique for getting rid of stoolies in those days was to encase the victim's feet in cement and then drop him into a nearby body of water. The mafia's code of conduct includes rules about 2 categories of outsiders who are not to be treated violently and certainly not killed unless this becomes absolutely unavoidable. The 2 categories are law enforcement people and journalists. Any mobster who killed a cop, an FBI agent, or a reporter would have some very tall explaining to do to his bosses. The reasons for these prohibitions are not hard to understand. They certainly have nothing to do with any sort of morality or tenderness towards these kind of people. Cop killings and journalist killings produce the most intense heat, with the authorities under great pressure from public opinion to track down those killers. Those who run the mafia tend to shun almost any publicity. They try to avoid stirring up any more negative publicity than they usually get, and they are absolutely obsessed with the desire to avoid the glaring and inescapable publicity that is aroused when some trigger-happy hood takes it upon himself to get a lawman or reporter who may be on his tail. There is only one exception to this rule. It comes into effect in the case of a corrupt law enforcement agent who is working with the mob. If he is exposed and arrested and then informs on the mob in order to save himself, he is fair game and can be treated like any other mobster who has turned. In the words of Fat Vinnie Teresa, the rule is you don't put policemen to sleep unless they're bad ones. The resulting police investigation is unlikely to be as intense as in the case of an honest cop. And then that's it. That pretty much ends chapter 2 of the book Super Mafia, Organized Crime Threatens America. Once again, the chapter being called Inside the Mafia. So let's go ahead and let's talk about that here. For starters, you can see it gave some rich info, some final info associated with being inside the mafia. It started off with talking about the killings that mafias were doing in terms of rituals. Apparently, an old ritual was if something happened and it was a mercenary kill, Then it was involving the body of whoever was killed being placed into a plastic bag and then taking $20 bills torn in half. It reminded me of The Godfather. There's that famous scene where the guy, the big guy, I can't remember his name, but his vest was found and there was a fish inside, and obviously it's an old ritual, according to them, stating that he's sleeping with the fishes. So it reminded me essentially of that part there. And then it went into further details about some of the other plots that the Mafia had inside their own organization. They had that crazy story associated with Joe Bonanno. He was apparently trying to kill, or planning to kill, the entire New York Mafia leadership. I mean, talk about an overall dumb plan. If you have something like that happen, you better believe there's going to be retaliation. And on top of that, you're going to have the authorities coming at you as well. And so how long did he expect actually for that to work? Even if he would have found victory, like how long would that have been successful for him before something else happens to him? The term Pyrrhic victory is the stuff that immediately came to mind for me. And then you had that other guy, Joe Colombo, that took advantage of that opportunity and ratted on him. And then he, in turn, was rewarded with his own powerful Brooklyn family. But as it stated, he ended up deciding to do another bad thing. He started that Italian-American Civil Rights League to combat anti-Italian prejudice. And so when that happened, that put out the tension that the Mafia didn't want. And so because of it, they ended up hiring a gunman to kill him there. It's crazy stuff. Like when it was talking about also about Team A and Team B, and that there were bombings, that was very alarming too, because that's the first I've heard of that. Usually when there's Mafia killings, from what I've read, they're very careful about not involving civilians. That just brings, as the chapter highlighted, too much heat. Not really because they want to avoid killings. I would say like it's 95% there. They don't want to have anybody killed that shouldn't be killed, but otherwise it brings on that heat. And so what happens is a bomb is indiscriminate. It goes off and there happens to be some civilians around it. There is no other opportunity for them. And so that'll bring unnecessary heat from the cops, the authorities, and then also from the people around that area. They're going to be mad at the Mafia, and that's only so far that they can go when it comes to helping out the community, quote unquote, and staying on their good side. So in this case, having those bombs go off, that was pretty it was something that I did not expect at that point. And then lastly, there was the one involving violence, how apparently there's another ritual associated where when someone has something involving a status of being an informer, when that happens, then apparently there's 5 shots fired upward through the informant's chin. And so that's a way of showcasing that this is the specific method, illustrating that they were an informant. And it also pretty much makes it a closed coffin funeral. Like you can't have an open coffin, so it robs the family of that opportunity as well. And then there was the other irony, how the only time you can really kill a cop, which is again tying into killing civilians and so on, it's a no-no when it comes to the Mafia's code. They don't want that heat. They don't want anyone else to absolutely come towards them and then have so much anger and so on. But it's okay, apparently, if it's a corrupt law enforcement agent and they're exposed. So in other words, if they're the ones that worked with the Mafia, but then somehow they became exposed and then they became arrested, and it could turn into them turning into an informant, then that's when essentially they get rubbed out. That quote that the guy gave at the end, Fat Vinny Teresa, says, "You don't put policemen to sleep unless they're bad ones." That was an irony too, because apparently to them, the bad ones are the bad cops that turn into informants, not because of the fact it's a cop turning bad. It's because that the cop already became bad and then turned into informant. But let me know what you guys think. Post your comments below about this wonderful chapter. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.